Welcome, everybody. The title of this lecture is Reframing History, and it's an analysis of the 500 Years of Resistance comic book by Gord Hill. I'd like to start just by introducing myself and acknowledging the territories on which I am giving this lecture. My name is Sophie McCall, and I was born in Kampala, Uganda. And some of the earliest stories that I remember focused on the urgency of decolonization and the devastating effects of colonial mapmaking in the place of my birth. But within my own family, as important as those stories were, those lessons were not always applied to the Canadian context. And so a lot of my learning has been to understand the role of colonization and the importance of decolonization on these lands in Canada. I've lived and worked on the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations since 2002 with my partner and 2 kids. It's an honor to think about the work that I do here at the university with a sense of accountability and responsibility to these unceded lands. And this territorial acknowledgement allows us a moment to think about what it means to be a part of an ongoing occupation of Indigenous lands and how to be relevant and become an ally in Indigenous-led initiatives for decolonization. And you'll see that these themes are very important to the text that we will be discussing today. So Gord Hill's extraordinary book, 500 Years of Resistance. It's a comic book or a graphic novel. And this lecture will focus especially on the enormous impact of pandemics like smallpox, tuberculosis, measles, and influenza in the making of the Americas, the so-called New World. Although when you look closely, you will have to call into question that very label, the New World. And you can see here a photograph of some ancient pyramids, which from Peru, which are believed to be up to 500 years older than the pyramids in Egypt. And it's kind of strange, don't you think, that this is still knowledge that is not well known or established, even though the technological advances in radiocarbon dating can conclude that pretty conclusively. So who is Gord Hill? He is an artist, an historian, and an activist. And he's from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation. So you see in the map below that the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation is on the northern tip of Vancouver Island. And he also has Tlingit ancestry and Scottish ancestry. And the Tlingit Nation goes from the top northern corner of BC and into Alaska, as you can see on this map. He is the author of 3 comic books, and I think you can tell he's not interested in creating comic books that that pretend to be objective. He's an activist historian who wants to draw attention to the importance of politically positioning oneself. He is also a carver, and that's interesting in terms of his chosen genre of the comic book. The Indigenous graphic arts that he shows in these comic books highlight the design features of some Indigenous nations that are used in carving and other Indigenous graphic arts. As an artist, he has participated in some of the protests, occupations, and blockades that he describes. So that gives you a little snapshot of who Gord Hill is. So as I say, this book is called 500 Years of Resistance, and his main goal is to highlight precisely that narrative of Indigenous resistance in the making of the Americas. Still to this day, the story of the last 500 years is often filtered through a now largely discredited narrative of discovery. And that top image of Columbus Day, which has become so fiercely contested, not only in recent years, for 50 years, it's been, for 500 years, it's been contested. What you'll often find is that narrative of discovery instead has been exposed as 500 years of genocide. And that certainly is a very important narrative to correct that history of discovery. However, if the story of genocide is the only story, it risks sidelining the persistence of Indigenous peoples' survival and resistance. And I do have students, when I've taught this book in other classes, they have said to me, this is the first time they've really been taught the story of Indigenous resistance. So Gord Hill writes in the preface, and I think this is a very clear and important statement of his aim. Unfortunately, the history we are taught through the educational system and corporate entertainment industry is false, particularly its depiction of European colonization as inevitable or even justified, and Indigenous peoples as helpless victims or even willing participants. So that's his goal, is to challenge that very established narrative. There are three big questions that I will be addressing in this lecture. So the first one is, what is illuminated in shifting the story of the Americas away from 500 years since discovery, as well as away from 500 years of genocide? What are the overlooked stories that emerge through the lens of 500 years of resistance? The second question is, why did disease have such a disproportionate effect on Indigenous peoples? And why weren't there significant made in the Americas plagues that the Europeans had no resistance to? And the third question is, why did Gord Hill choose the medium of the comic book or graphic novel to convey the story of 500 years of resistance in the making of Americas? So there are 4 parts to his book. And I've shown you how they, the length of each, because I think this indicates the importance that he places upon these different parts. So the first part is Invasion, 1492, Invasion, and that's 9 pages. Part 2 is called Resistance, and it's 23 pages. Part 3 is called Assimilation, and it only covers 2 pages. And finally, part 4 is called Renewed Resistance, and it starts from around 1967 to the present, and it's 25 pages long. So part 1, Invasion, describes how European invaders occupied and colonized the Americas. And here you can see how Gord Hill graphically illustrates the rape, the torture, the violence that accompanied this moment of contact. But ironically, even though there was this extraordinarily unequal contest in terms of weaponry, and in terms of, essentially savagery of this first contact, the Europeans that arrived were already suffering tremendously from economic and social upheavals, widespread poverty, resource depletion, disease, famine, and war in Europe. And so, as Gord Hill puts it in the preface, the invasion of the Americas revived a dying Europe. infusing it with new agricultural goods and resources such as gold and silver. So as you can see here, he shows that the context in Europe was one of desperation. And so arriving here, there was a rush to plummet the resources that were available. One thing that is important to note is the disproportionate effects of disease. One of the panels that Gord Hill illustrates is of Columbus in his coffin. So Columbus was marooned for a year, and in 1504 he was rescued, and in 1506 he died in Spain. And it's surmised, it's possible that he caught a disease, a tropical disease from the Americas. But that was, there were those diseases that Europeans suffered from, diseases in the Americas, but there just wasn't the kind of pandemics that the Europeans brought to the Americas. And so while Indigenous people suffered from these from the wars and the military clashes that occurred almost right from the beginning, by far the greatest killer were the diseases. And so take, for example, he notes that from 1492 to 1514, in a period of 20 years, the Taino dropped from 8 million to just 28,000. And so the general, I mean, it's hard to know exactly, but up to 90% of some populations were killed from these pandemics. The numbers are very much in dispute as to how many Indigenous people were originally in the Americas at the time that the Europeans first arrived. But it seems that at the very minimum, 500 million, and some have gone as far as 100 million people were living in the Americas in 1491. And those numbers plummeted over the next, let's say, about 100 years, but then continuing on with different waves of pandemics. So part 2 is a substantially longer section. And here we learn of the extraordinary and lengthy, over decades and even centuries, of resistance that Indigenous nations across the Americas showed against this invasion, occupation, and colonization, and how they used their knowledge of the land and its resources to fight the invaders. On this page 37, which I have cut in half and placed side by side, you can see how Gord Hill refutes popular misconceptions of what happened in the early years of the invasion. So he starts out by saying the colonization of the Americas by European forces was not easy. It involved centuries of war as our ancestors fought a life and death struggle. Even just that, I find, is often downplayed, the idea that somehow the colonization of the Americas happened almost inevitably. But no, this was clearly not the case. And somehow it's a convenient forgetting that settler society often demonstrates. Then he goes on to say that the resistance began almost immediately as well. And again, that's something that is not always emphasized. And the losses from direct war were substantial, but they were again nothing compared to the losses related to disease. And so, for example, the Aztecs population were reduced from 24 million to just 3 million. And this was largely due to disease and then starvation. And I think that's a really other key point, is the role of starvation. Part of the warfare involved cutting Indigenous people off from their food sources. And so the impact of disease is obviously much more intense when you are suffering from a lack of food. So that was a really important thing as well. And yet, despite all of this, for several centuries, that means a couple of hundred years, the Europeans were limited to mostly coastal regions. And here you can see the advantage of using a graphic novel form where he can illustrate so powerfully and so succinctly how the coastal regions are just tiny fractures of the Americas. And so obviously the Europeans were limited by factors such as terrain, weather, disease, and resistance. I'd also like to point out Gord Hill's careful attention to the Indigenous graphic arts of many individual nations. And here he has this warrior. He says, "This is a Mexica eagle warrior with obsidian-edged club." And so he, in all of the drawings, he pays really careful attention to the dress, to the weaponry, to the tattoos, to the carvings, to all the graphic arts that are shown. And the graphic novel is obviously an excellent medium by which to foreground these graphic arts. So as I mentioned before, part 3 of the book is only 2 pages long. And yet today, this is the section of history that we focus on the most, I'd say, especially in educational contexts. I think it's obviously of great importance that finally Canada and BC is confronting this history of residential schools, of land theft, of the creation of reserves, of the role of the Indian Act in dispossessing Indigenous people, of displacing them from their lands, and of suppressing their languages, cultures, and customs, and systems of governance. All of this is so important. And we now recognize the importance of teaching this history of assimilation and genocide. And yet this narrative of assimilation and genocide, if it's taught in isolation from a narrative of Indigenous resistance, then that narrative can etch deeply a story of trauma and loss and tragedy that risks sidelining Indigenous people's survivance. So that word survivance is a portmanteau word which combines survival and resistance. And it's a word that's often used in Indigenous studies in order to convey that incredible cultural continuance that is so evident today. So you can see here in this, these are 2 panels from the section assimilation. And the first one, it shows residential schools and the role of religion at those residential schools. And the image on the right shows a mix of symbols on the wall, which show that contest between settler and Indigenous ideas and cultures. So we have a kind of a Pacific Northwest coast inspired orca that's designed with some aspects of Pacific Northwest coast design, and it's kind of tugging at the Canadian flag. And just below that killer whale is an image of the cross. On the TV screen, we see an image of a stereotypical sort of native chief, with the big feather headdress. And these symbols together show that the integrity and uniqueness of each individual nation is being eroded or effaced. And there's this contest between Canadian and Indigenous symbols that has led to a sense of disorientation or loss of sense of direction for the people pictured in this panel. And so this is all that he has to say about assimilation, and he wants to turn our attention back to the history of resistance. So part 4 is called Renewed Resistance. And I'd like to point out that in this section, there's a section on the American Indian movement. And the AIM was founded in 1968. And interestingly, I didn't realize this until I was rereading this book earlier this week, that the American Indian movement was founded in Minneapolis. And I think that's interesting to think about what Gord Hill presents in this section of Renewed Resistance in terms of how the contest between Indigenous resistance movements and state authority symbols. What we learn of is the reasons behind the many road blockades, train blockades, conflicts over fisheries, etc., that we see in contemporary times. It was just about a year ago or a little bit earlier that every day in the news before the pandemic hit, that we heard about the contest between the Coastal GasLink and the Wet'suwet'en people in northern BC. And then leading from that point into the pandemic, we can see familiar images where the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has underlined the urgency of some of the history and the present reality that 500 years of resistance vividly describes. The pandemic has amplified the intersections between racial violence, poverty, health conditions, and systemic inequalities, resulting in the most vulnerable in society continuing to pay the highest price. So the news of police murders of Black and Indigenous citizens, including George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Chantal Moore, Rodney Levy, and others, sparked globally coordinated demonstrations by Black Lives Matter and other affiliated groups. And these events reflect the violent afterlives of slavery and land takeover in the history of the making of the Americas, but they are also connected to the disproportionate effect of the pandemic on vulnerable BIPOC communities. So Gord Hill also shows that the connections between racialized violence and the disproportionate impact of devastating pandemics can be traced back in history, as this panel shows. So here we see in 1862, there was a smallpox epidemic in Victoria, and the colonial authorities forced Indigenous people to return to their villages and to leave the city. So what happened, of course, is that the infected individuals then spread the disease within their own village communities. And this smallpox epidemic resulted in an estimated of 1 in 3 people dying in 2 years. And there were several waves of pandemics in which the newly established colonial authority used their policies and in ways which increased the vulnerability and the danger that Indigenous people suffered under this process of land takeover. So big question number 2, why did disease have such a or not really disease, but epidemics have such a disproportionate effect on Indigenous people? And why weren't there significant made in the Americas plagues that the Europeans had no resistance to? So I would strongly encourage you to read Charles Mann's 2005 book called 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus. There's also a children's illustrated version of this book, which is really excellent. My kids love it as well, and it's very smart but very condensed and accessible in its history writing. And I'd also love for you to check out this YouTube video. It's only 12 minutes long. It's called America Pox, the Missing Plague. And this YouTube video asks and answers that question directly. Why were there no pandemics that killed off Europeans when they arrived in the Americas? So a big part of the answer is the role of domesticated animals. This is a screenshot from the video that I just mentioned, in which you can see that horses, pigs, cows, chickens, goats, lambs, all came from Europe. And they only arrived in the Americas at the time that Europeans did. The only semi-domesticated animal from the Americas was the llama, or is the llama, which remains a proudly independent animal, not an easy one to domesticate, not as friendly as our friend the pig. And so as we know from the COVID-19 pandemic, viruses become especially dangerous when they jump from one species to another. And in Europe, these domesticated animals lived in very close quarters with humans. And as cities began to expand, and more people arrived. They arrived with their animals, who were essential for their survival, and the domesticated animals enabled incredible population booms, because they helped with the fields. They provided food, they provided clothing, and so on. But in living in such close quarters, with the rise of towns and cities, this created the perfect storm for these terrible pandemic diseases, which are pandemic diseases are different from just regular diseases, obviously. So virtually all the pandemics that we know of trace back to domesticated animals, such as smallpox, tuberculosis, measles, influenza. The Black Death, or bubonic plague, came from fleas on rats, but rats are not native to America. They probably came to Europe from Asia around 1300, and they quickly established their close quarters with humans. And of course, they were aboard the ships when they left Europe and arrived in America. So what about city centers? Weren't they the cause of plagues? And I was mentioning earlier that it's possible that the very largest city center existed in the Americas, in Peru, about 2500 or even 3000 BC. And so this is at a time or even earlier than the Egyptian pyramids. So why weren't these city centers overrun by plagues before the Europeans arrived? And basically the answer is they did not have domesticated animals. It's also possible that these city centers, although containing at times very large numbers of people, were ritual spaces, and they were not necessarily occupied year-round. So that might have been another factor. But so city centers on their own do not necessarily create pandemics. So a really important impact of pandemics in the Americas was in creating the concept of terra nullius. Terra nullius means empty land, and it is actually a legal term within British common law that justifies you to take the land. You know, if the land is considered to be empty, then you have the right to claim it as yours. But so disease created one of the most stubbornly persistent misconceptions of the so-called new world, which is that misconception of terra nullius. So I have two pictures of classically empty, what appear to be empty land, the Great Plains and the Amazon. But in fact, we now understand that Indigenous peoples helped cultivate these natural landscapes over thousands of years. So take the Amazon. Originally, anthropologists and archaeologists thought that Indigenous peoples of the Amazon always did what they do today, which is slash and burn a small section of the jungle. And then when you burn that wood, it creates the nutrients necessary to grow plants. And they would live on that land for a couple of years. But because the Amazon soil is actually very poor in its quality, you'd have to move from that place and start again, slashing and burning a new section of jungle within something like 5 years. But in fact, what they now realize is that the Amazon is actually a tree orchard. And all that incredible richness of fruit trees and nut trees were actually planted by humans over thousands of years. Another example is the Great Plains. To a large extent, these Great Plains were engineered by Indigenous people. And every year, Indigenous people would burn part of the forest to keep the Great Plains large, and in fact, to increase the size of the Great Plains. But then, when the diseases arrived, the diseases traveled through the land independently and much more quickly than individual traders or travelers. And so the disease could spread via trade items, via wild animals who came into contact with domesticated animals, through a variety of factors. And so when George Vancouver, for example, arrived in the Pacific Northwest coast in 1792, he found deserted villages, abandoned boats, and dead bodies. The few survivors were scarred and blinded with smallpox. So you can see how that perception of terra nullius reinforced the idea for settlers of free and empty land for the taking. So big question number 3, why did Gord Hill choose the medium of the comic book or the graphic novel to convey this story of 500 years of resistance in the making of Americas? Well, one of the reasons that he states in his preface is accessibility. He wanted to reach as wide an audience as possible. And he figured the combination of text and image was much more engaging and accessible for all levels of readers. Also economy. He is trying to tell the story of 500 years spanning the Americas within 60 pages. It's quite an accomplishment. Of course, he's giving an overview, yet he does offer some really compelling details within that overview. But perhaps the word is more counterview. A counter view of 500 years of contact. And that word view is really important when you think about the visual impact of the graphic novel and the counter framing of events that he is trying to make us aware of. So it's almost like, imagine if you a graphic novel as looking through a viewfinder of a camera, and you're framing and cutting out and focusing on one particular image. And that's like a panel in a graphic novel. But if you're trying to draw attention to a picture that has not been told or has not been as accessible, then you're going to get a counter view of a familiar story. All right, and so in this process of creating these counter views, he's using the techniques of reframing the history that we have been taught. Not only is he reframing, but he's also deframing and shattering those frames in order to bring about this counter narrative. I've mentioned as well how Gord Hill has such close attention to the nation-specific design traditions of all the nations that he depicts in the form of clothing, tattoos, carvings, weaponry, armor, masks, headdresses, etc. And as a carver himself, he has an ability to notice those nation-specific traditions, and in that way he avoids lumping all Indigenous people together, and instead really highlights the unique aspects of each Indigenous nation. Another thing that's interesting about this image is of these warriors bursting through this doorway. And in that way, there is that emphasis on shattering the frames of how we view colonial history and how we view the role of Indigenous people in that colonial history. And in spite of the European with the gun, it's the warriors who are breaking down that door. So in conclusion, Gord Hill demonstrates the profound and devastating impact of pandemics on Indigenous nations for 500 years. And yet he also provides a powerful antidote, or you could say a viral resistance to this narrative of contact and of invasion. The comic book allows Hill to create an accessible history book that immediately engages the reader. And the comic book form also allows him to economically cover a huge range in terms of both geographic space and historical time. He uses the vocabulary of the comic book to reframe, deframe, and shatter the frames of history. The comic book allows Hill to highlight the intricate beauty and uniqueness of individual Indigenous nations' graphic art expressions. So thank you so much for listening.